Okay, we'll make a start. Welcome to tonight's online information session about the Bayswater Project Design Guidelines. My name is Catherine Bentley and I will be your host for this evening. I'd like to start this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we are meeting tonight, the Whadjuk people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Tonight, you will hear from two of our senior managers in regards to the Bayswater East Project Design Guidelines. First, you'll hear from Matt Ryan, who is the Executive General Manager for Planning. And secondly, we will be joined by Ryan Keys, who is the Head of our Statutory Planning and Approvals. Tonight, we'll be providing you with an overview of the design guidelines for the METRONET East Bayswater project. We'll be explaining Development WA's role and the proposed approach at each precinct level. You're very welcome to submit questions at any time throughout the session tonight, and we will be getting to as many of them as possible following the presentations. To ask a question, simply toggle your mouse to the bottom of the screen until you see the Q&A button. Then click on the button, type your question and press submit. We'll be receiving your questions at our end, but please keep in mind that we may receive many questions tonight and may not be able to get through all of them. I do want to mention that tonight that this webinar is being recorded and we'll be letting everyone know who registered when you can access a copy of this recording in the coming days. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Matt Ryan, the Executive General Manager for Planning and Transition. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for making yourselves available. Much appreciated, as Catherine said. I am a member of the executive here at Development WA. I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan, who's to my right. You haven't seen him yet. So we're here to talk about the design guidelines for Bayswater. Ryan will take you through much of the detail of the Bayswater design guidelines. I get to do the fun bit at the start and give you some of the background and context as to how we got here, and perhaps answer some of the simpler questions around what design guidelines are and how they apply and what they do, and just as importantly, don't do. We appreciate that a redevelopment area is not something that people are necessarily familiar with, so I just wanted to try and provide you with some background and context just before we launch into the detail. Catherine, can we go to the next slide that doesn't have my face on it so I don't have to talk at a picture of myself? Thank you. So this one is an important contextual point before we get into Bayswater, just to acknowledge that the work we're doing here is part of the METRONET program of works being undertaken by government. So you're probably all aware of the Bayswater station development that's in play at the moment. Our role with the planning system is to complement that and create the precinct around it. But this slide is essentially just an acknowledgement of the broader picture that we're trying to fit within government's objective of creating those METRONET precincts around new stations. Bayswater is a particularly significant station, being that it's got the junction of the three lines. I think that technically makes it the most trafficked station outside of Perth, as it'll have the Midland line, the Morley-Ellenbrook line, as well as the airport line, all interchanging through Bayswater. That, coupled with its central Perth location, makes it very suitable for a redevelopment area. Thanks, Catherine. So on this slide here, I primarily wanted to talk to you a little bit about scope and what we're responsible for and what other agencies are responsible for. It's a fairly busy space, given that there's local government and various state government agencies involved in this project. And I think it's just important that we clarify we're out for consultation on our design guidelines at the moment, and we should just be clear with you what that gives you an opportunity to comment on, and perhaps just as much what it doesn't allow the opportunity to engage on. So those two slides there on the right, you'll all be well familiar with the Metro networks that are underway for the station, the $253 million worth of investment in the station upgrades and the surrounding public realm. That is obviously underway and is being delivered by the METRONET office and falls outside the planning framework discussion that we're having tonight. So our role, the picture on the left, is to create a planning scheme over the redevelopment area or the project area, which is shown in pink there. So we're here as a planning regulator, and our work primarily relates to the public realm. So we'll create a framework, which we'll detail to you tonight, that talks about provisions and the type of development that we're after in the precinct. And then our role becomes assessing development proposals as they come in over the short and longer term. So the point there being that this process is complementary to and it's coordinated with the train station works, but it's not another opportunity to revisit what's going on in that particular project. The other key point I wanted to focus there is that we probably should have put the City of Bayswater on this slide because they're an important partner and a part of this project as well. So when we take planning responsibility over a local government area or part of a local government area, the local government still retains all other functions. So we become the planning regulator, we assess development applications and progress them through and create the frameworks. However, the City of Bayswater continues to do the stuff that you know that they normally do, from mowing the lawns and upgrading and looking after the roads and footpaths and that sort of thing. We also do continue to work closely with them in that planning capacity while we're here. So there's a few different entities doing different things. It's the catalyst is the METRONET station upgrades, and our work is to put the planning framework around it and turn it into more than just a station, but a precinct that complements it and make sure that we get best use out of that investment and the area. Thanks, Catherine. This is an extension of the last slide. It's the only one that refers to legislations and acts and regulations, I promise, but it's just important to highlight how we create a redevelopment area. So we have an act, the Metropolitan Redevelopment Act. We created the Bayswater project area back in 2020 by an amendment to the redevelopment regulations, the box that sits underneath the act. And we gazetted a scheme for METRONET East. So the METRONET East scheme relates to our broader redevelopment area, which also picks up the upcoming High Wycombe station, as well as the future upgraded Midland station and this one. So this particular redevelopment area has those 3 METRONET hubs in it. We have 5 redevelopment areas in total across Perth, Central Perth, Scarborough, Armidale, Subiaco and METRONET East. So in May, late May, so only a couple of months ago, we gazetted the scheme for the METRONET East redevelopment area, which means if you submit a development application within the project area at this time, it will come to us for determination as opposed to the City of Bayswater. The 2 key documents which we'll speak about tonight are, when you fall down into the statutory box at the bottom there, the design guidelines. So Ryan will detail those for you shortly. Many of you have probably already taken the opportunity to have a look at the design guidelines, which are out for comment at the moment on our website, and they provide the really detailed planning provisions. We've also released our planning strategy, which hangs off on the side there as a strategic document that was released at the same time. And that gives you a line of sight between the background work that we've done all the way through to the actual statutory documents that we've come up with. So on that project area, which will pop up on your screen in a moment, there it is. So that was established by that amendment to our regs back in 2020, as I mentioned. The key thing about this project area, and this is just about detailing some of the planning history, this mirrors the town of Bayswater, or what was originally initiated by the town of Bayswater's Bayswater Town Centre Structure Plan. So that journey started back in 2017, and we've built upon that from here. You'll see a core precinct and a frame precinct within that picture, and I might just ask Catherine to flick to the next slide, which will detail that a little bit clearer. So this town centre structure plan was first drafted in 2017, as I mentioned. It then went to the West Australian Planning Commission after it was advertised to the public, and it was determined through that process that what we call the core, being the orange bit in the middle, wouldn't follow R codes in the normal planning framework. It would go through to a redevelopment area, and that the orange bit would be subject to design guidelines. So that's specifically what we're here to talk to you about tonight, the design guidelines applicable to the core area around the town centre and the station. We've broken the core up into further precincts, and Ryan will go through each of those. But that's the origins of the project area, and it's just important to highlight that this started all the way back in 2017, and there's been considerable detailed planning done by the Planning Commission and the City of Bayswater, and we haven't ignored that. We've absolutely built upon it to get to where we are now. Similarly, in the same vein, there's been a lot of planning work that's been undertaken since 2017. There's been a lot of community engagement work that's already been underway to inform that process. So there's that date of 2017 again. The City of Bayswater undertook extensive consultation through to METRONET, who I know will have engaged with many of you as they've undertaken their project for the station and associated public realm, through to most recently, we undertook an engagement exercise in 2020, which received just shy of 1,000 responses, 3 responses shy of 1,000 in fact, which was great. And we're hoping to get similar sort of engagement out of you on these design guidelines. So that process particularly honed in on the project vision, which I'll go to a slide in a moment, which will talk about that, and perceptions on density and opportunities for the town centre. So that received quite a lot of views and has gone a long way to informing our vision for the area, which essentially forms our strategy, which in turn flows into the design guidelines and the prescribed requirements that we've come up with. The outcomes of that community survey process, I won't go through them all in complete detail, but there was a common theme of a desire from the community to support local business and economic growth. You'll see a lot of these themes here on this page come through as we progress through the coming slides on the planning documents that we've prepared. A lot of these translate into the vision and objectives for the planning scheme that we've come up with. The enhanced urban tree canopy there is an important one, which has been a really recurrent theme of engagement so far. Bayswater residents clearly value that leafy environment, and in addition to that, that sense of place and historic character of the town centre. The other couple there that I think are of particular interest, the increased nightlife and mix of housing types and apartments, townhouses, etc. Both of those things suggest that the community has an appetite for a critical mass of population to come into the area to add vibrancy and add activity. So that coupled against those sense of place requirements are really what I keep referring to as our goalposts. So in Bayswater, we already have an established great community, which clearly has character and a sense of identity. We also have a desire to see that developed further and enhanced by more people, more activation and more happening. The other one that does keep coming up as well is point 4 there, the connection between the north and south of the project area, so through the train station from the town centre over to the northern side of Bayswater. So that's the community survey outcomes, which, as I say, informed our Bayswater vision, which is on the screen. I won't read it out. There's probably a couple of key points out of this. So as I mentioned, my favourite word, goalposts. So what we're trying to achieve here is the state has invested significantly in the station upgrades, upwards of $250 million. Government has made a clear commitment towards getting population around station precincts and providing infill density. So we need to accept that as part of this redevelopment exercise, there is going to be some additional people, population and density within the project area. But at the same time, we need to balance that against the existing character, particularly some of the historic buildings and the tree retention, which makes Bayswater the place that it is today. So those are the two sort of key points to me. The other components within our vision relate to quality built form outcomes. We've had very clear feedback from the community that you want quality development in there. So that's where the design guidelines and what Ryan will come to shortly really comes into this to make sure that when redevelopment does occur, if it does occur on particular sites, that it'll be done in the right way and a good product. That's probably my quick overview of the vision. This is just to touch on that we've also released the redevelopment strategy, which, as I said, accompanies the design guidelines and the redevelopment scheme. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to jump onto our website and have a look at this one as well. It provides you a lot of the background around why we've arrived at what we've arrived at. So the planning history and the consultation history that I've just mentioned. We've also done a fair bit of feasibility work around market take-up, urban design, and some heritage consultation analysis as well. And some demographics work as well, which has informed what we think Bayswater might look like in 20, 30 years' time. So that is an interesting read. If you have the time, I'd encourage you to have a look. What came out of that is 6 strategic directions, which I think will pop up on the next slide. And again, so 1 and 4 are the two that I keep coming back to. We need to accept that there's going to be some development, but we've got to do it the right way and enhance Bayswater's existing sense of place as opposed to compromising it. So those directions on the screen have informed our statutory planning framework. I won't go through them as I'm sure you can read them. So this slide on the right-hand side of the screen is the redevelopment scheme document. So it's the scheme that empowers us to create these design guidelines. And this is just to capture and rehash what I've just been through basically, which is the 4 key things that fed into developing this scheme. So the METRONET work, acknowledging the significant investment that has occurred, the strategy that we've developed, the town centre structure plan, so the historic planning, it's not historic, it's only a few years old, but the previous planning work that has been undertaken, as well as the various community engagement, capturing the sense of place for Bayswater. Just before Ryan launches into the detail of the design guidelines, we've been given a very clear instruction by our decision makers, so our board and our land redevelopment committee. I'll explain what those are in a moment, that this is to be a meaningful engagement exercise. Sometimes people feel like when we go out with these documents in draft, that we've already made up our mind and we're presenting these things to you to let you know what we've come up with. And I cannot impress upon you enough, if there's one thing you take away from tonight, it's that we are really keen to hear your feedback about this document. We've tried to come up with a balanced solution between my two goalposts of trying to achieve density and retain character. It's inherently a subjective subject, so people are going to have different opinions and disagree and agree with various components. We will absolutely take on board any and all commentary that comes in through this process. And I would absolutely encourage you to please jump online and make a submission once we finish this session and you've read the design guidelines and had an opportunity to go through it. We went through a fairly extensive process to get here. This was about 12 months worth of work. We went through, so we have a board here at Development WA, and underneath that board, we have a land redevelopment committee. So a land redevelopment committee advises the board on strategic planning matters. That committee comprises a local government representative from the council, a couple of independent experts and a member of our board. They looked at these design guidelines a couple of times and they really strongly impressed upon us to make sure that the community knows that they want to hear from them. So next time we go to one of those meetings, they don't want to hear from Ryan and I explaining to them what we think the right thing to do is. They want us to be able to go back with commentary from the community. So with that, I'll hand back to Catherine and let Ryan go through the detail, but please ask lots of questions and Ryan and I will do our best to answer. I'm sure some clever people will come up with things that we can't answer, but we'll make an effort to get back to you. And please make a comment and engage on the process. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matt. Just a reminder for those of you who have joined us, if you would like to ask a question throughout tonight's presentation, I'll just ask you to go to the bottom of your screen and you will toggle through what is a Q&A selection. If you just click on that button, you can type your question in there and press submit, and that will go back to our team who will be providing those questions to our panel, Matt, Andrew, Ryan, for later in tonight's session. So if you would like to ask a question, we'd welcome you to do that throughout tonight's session. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ryan Keys, who's Head of Statutory Planning and Approvals at Development WA. Over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Matt, for the introduction. While I'll be talking through the particular details of the design guidelines, and particularly precinct by precinct, getting into some of the detail that we know people in Bayswater have a strong passion and keen desire for their overall Bayswater to progress and develop going forward in the future in a way that's suitable for Bayswater, but also people have particular interest in what's happening in their particular patch of Bayswater, in their precinct, as we call it. So I'll be getting into that. But the introduction from Matt really highlighted for us about how the starting point of how we go about this. While the guidelines themselves talk specifically to what will happen on privately held sites, or what's able, how we will assess proposals that come forward, the introduction that Matt went through and the work we've been doing in getting to know the people of Bayswater, and been very fortunate to meet a lot of you out there already and look forward to doing so further over the next few weeks, is really what makes a place is about the people of Bayswater, what you do in the area, how you live, how you work, how you recreate, how you entertain yourself, those sort of things. So what we're about to talk through in terms of the physical way forward for Bayswater is really about enabling that. How do we continue to tell the story of Bayswater, where it's come from and where it's going to be in the future? Thanks, Catherine. Particularly, I will get into the precincts, but just to start with, and this is a page out of the design guidelines, and it's just starting to get into some of the physical consideration of the Bayswater context. And this just sets out our view that then starts to influence the key drivers and influences about how we've gone about defining what will happen in each part of Bayswater. The key features here in this diagram are that the train stations Matt's spoken about will be substantially larger than what was or has been the Bayswater station, being a suburban station midway between Perth and Midland into the junction that it will be in a couple of years. So that's shown becoming a significant feature of Bayswater. Topographically, in its landforms, it shows the high ground around that area, and particularly that's where people live. So going back many, many thousands of years ago through its more recent history of Bayswater, really showing how people use the area of living up on the high ground would come into that lower bowl of Bayswater, where the main street is, where the train station is, and also what's around it, the public open space is shown as prominent features in there. So Bayswater being really fortunate already in terms of opportunity to take on more people living and working in the area through that built form, that it is well blessed with significant public open space, both passive and active, so people can get out, walk through under the tree canopy, but also in those parks and reserves in a more passive recreational space. The main street is a key feature of that, the connectivity there through the train station. So we understand that the future of Bayswater, the heart of Bayswater traditionally has been around that King William Street zone. And I'll talk a bit through that in our built form controls, but also a key feature being needing to connect well from that King William Street area through and under the train station into the areas north of that train station in a meaningful way to make Bayswater continue to work as a consistent and integrated connected town. Thanks, Catherine. Again, some of the physical features, just to touch on really briefly or show, I won't go through this in particular detail, was some of the things we did look at other than taking on the feedback and the inputs from yourselves as the community in terms of what Bayswater is and should be going forward. Some of the features that started to influence the physical forms and controls we're proposing or suggesting in our current draft design guidelines. Those things are such as the topography in terms of, other than just where the high ground is, where the low ground is, Bayswater has a really interesting landscape in terms of the different slope of land, and that factors into how easy or difficult it is to develop, and that's the diagram on the left. The bottom one there is a look at the different lot sizes. So the darker red ones are the larger lots going into the lighter pink and the grey, and particularly that looking for the opportunities, or those larger sites provide the opportunity for the ability to separate larger built form structures away from its neighbours, so it has less impact on it. So started to suggest to us perhaps where, when we're trying to balance out how to provide that population growing in Bayswater around the train station, about where that more significant built form could go, but integrate and interact with its surrounding neighbours in a better way. And of course, a key feature that Matt's already touched on is the landscape character of Bayswater. Really strong feature of it, really positive of it, and that starts to show the tree canopy setting for Bayswater that we want to preserve and enhance. It particularly shows there's some strong sense around that public open space, but particularly as I'll touch on some of the key features up on the northern side, looking to enhance in a particular way. Thanks, Catherine. The design guidelines are set up two aspects. It's done by sub-precincts, and I'll step through each of the 6 that we've defined in the design guidelines. In terms of starting how we've defined or come to these 6 precincts, so it's 5 precincts plus the train station. And our starting point for this is looking at the streetscape and the public realm character of each. That's how we've come about it. So looking at how each one is influenced, and then that starts to inform, starting with the public realm, the street, how people walking through Bayswater or being in Bayswater, and how those buildings could best interface with them. And then, as I say, going through the lot size, topography, those type of things I just touched on. In terms of the naming of the precincts, we have gone with the significant trees identified in the Bayswater area. And that's, again, just trying to pick up the theme of the landscape character of Bayswater that's starting to pick up those features. So it's more than the built form to us. While it's a very important aspect of it, and we understand it's very much a focus of the community, wanting to understand what is happening in their area, but that landscape quality, really we wanted to show how that will go out. And so that's how we're referring to these precincts as we go forward. And then we get into the height plan. So I understand this is a particular interest for people, starting to put numbers on things. You will note straight away that those 6 sub-precincts don't exactly match these height zones, for want of a better word, that we've defined in it. And that goes to, because it's not just about the height of the building in terms of those sub-precincts, it's about the land uses. And I'll touch on that as we go through. But you'll see there we've gone for, to get the balance of the population, looking at how will these sites be developed? Are they capable of accommodating a certain amount of density, which starts to influence how tall buildings could be? The large sites can get a little bit taller to what's against or next to those things. So that transition into the frame area that will be, and as per the structure plan, the lower 2-3 story type buildings, but getting that higher intensity around the train station, which was one of those key things came through the public consultation that we got, that differing views around where the height could be and should be and how tall buildings might get, but really getting to, you know, if we're going to have some, that it should be around the train station. So that hierarchy is going to be where it is. So that goes to 6 stories, as shown on that diagram, 6 stories south of the station, moving into more opportunity for significant scale on the north side of the train station. So the 8 stories along Beachborough Road, as you come down into the boulevard from the north down to the train station, 12 stories along Railway Parade, mostly in the Magnolia precinct, up to 15 stories in the Olive precinct. We also have an 8-story minimum identified in the Olive precinct, and that's particularly because they are the largest sites. They can accommodate a lot more density than perhaps some of the other areas in Bayswater, and I want to make sure that those opportunities are preserved for that style and scale of development. So we want, even if it takes a few more years as the station gets to completion and beyond, that we're getting an appropriate sense of scale and making sure that that pressure continues to be taken off the areas surrounding it. And this is a diagram just to show that relationship. So other than just the number of stories, and interested in all your feedback on the numbers of stories and the relationship of the small or shorter buildings to the taller buildings, but showing this is one of our overarching thinking. So as we start to consider the feedback and looking at the heights zones within the design guidelines, our mind will continue to go to this type of diagram to show reflective of the feedback that we got, no matter what the stories and the heights might be, that the taller buildings are on the north side of the train station, lower on the south, and then transitioning back into the frame area, into the single houses, group dwellings, townhouses, those type of things that already exist in Bayswater and are covered by the structure plan provisions under the R codes. That's Catherine. And now we'll step through to each of the 6 precincts, and we'll start in the middle of the precinct, or in the middle of the Bayswater project, and that's the train station. So identified as the Currajong precinct, and these slides are set up. So what I'll talk to on the left there, you've got what we have heard from you in terms of what you'd like to see in these precincts. There's about 10 general themes, so you'll see consistency of them, and each one goes through what are those key themes for each of the precincts, and then touch on how we've tried to interpret that in each of the provisions of the precincts. So for the Currajong precinct or station precincts, the key themes being about improving the connections between the north and south, the public spaces, encouraging social interaction, and supporting the existing local businesses and economic growth being the key things to be delivered in this precinct. Our response to this from those key themes, as well as the other few up there, in terms of the station upgrade being a catalyst for the revitalisation of Bayswater. Matt's touched on it. That's why Development WA is there, and then Redevelopment is created is to get a form in Bayswater that's suitable to the changing face and the changing place of Bayswater. It provides a clear connection between the Main Street zone north and south of the rail line, we touched on at the start, and also delivering a public plaza on the north side of the train station, which will encourage that social interaction and activation. Last one then to move through is the next one is lemon scented gum. So what is generally understood to be the traditional heart of Bayswater and along King William Street. So getting into, again, you'll see on the left-hand side, not surprisingly, with that, where the social interaction and connection to people, or where people have lived and worked over the years in Bayswater, really starting to get at a lot of things trying to be delivered in lemon scented gum, King William Street. So the key outcomes of that list, or 10 or so, is the vibrant cafe, restaurant and bar culture with increased nightlife activity. So as we bring people living and working into Bayswater, that opportunity to get down to the street level, into the bars, restaurants, cafes, interact, eat, drink, and really socialise. And that key feature of Bayswater that's been around, that real passion for Bayswater is really about the people of Bayswater interacting with each other. So making sure that's a key theme and continues to be that traditional heart, that social heart of Bayswater. Other than that, it's maintaining the physical character. So maintaining the character and style of the town centre with the existing buildings of the streetscapes, and building density concentrated in the Olive, lemon scented gum, this one, and the Magnolia precinct. So again, closest to the train station being the more appropriate for the greater intensity of development and vibrancy. Our planning response to this has been the unique streetscape with small commercial lot frontages and enhanced historical fabric. And I'll touch on that in a second. King William Street, the heritage inventory or heritage list coming over from what was in the City of Bayswater scheme is particularly prominent in this area, and it's a key feature of making sure that unique streetscape continues to be able to be read, the ongoing story of Bayswater from where it's been and where it's going, to make sure that while it might be changing in its physical form, that understanding as people come off the train station, come into Bayswater, move to that part of Bayswater to sit down, have a meal, have a drink with their friends or family, or meet visitors, that they can continue to understand what Bayswater is about. The slow speed environments where the priority is given to the pedestrians and cyclists, and the high quality contemporary new development which respects and promotes the historic buildings. For this site particularly, and obviously the station was a unique one. So the next slide gets into the particular built form outcomes for the lemon-scented gum. So for this one, reflective of that main street quality, it's about the active ground floor land uses, which will support both the day and nighttime activation, with the upper floor development set back 3 metres behind that main building line of contributory places. So looking to respect the existing historic fabric and make sure that interpretation, understanding of that historic built form continues to be understood, albeit that what's happening above and beyond and behind it can still provide that additional opportunity for living and working. That fine-grained detailing within King William Street is a key and defining feature of Bayswater. So that needs to be retained in its built form response in terms of the narrow lots, the small lot developments. That still needs to be reflected in the new built form that comes through, and that can be articulated through design, materials and finishes. And otherwise encouraging, because of that small lot development, we're not looking necessarily for every lot in King William Street, particularly if you can remember back to a few slides ago about the smallest lots being in this area, and that's reflective of its history, that we're probably looking for amalgamation of lots. So while we say a maximum height limit of 6 stories in this sub precinct, that also needs to be looked at with the setbacks necessary to deliver that. So it won't be that every existing lot within King William Street will be able to achieve the 6-story height limit. That might get to the 2 or 3 stories under the setbacks, but to be able to achieve up into the 3 to 6 stories with increased setback for separation, it's more likely people will need to work with 2 or even 3 lots work together to really achieve that maximum. So a key thing in terms of our built form controls is to reach that maximum. It may be that not as many buildings as lots exist on King William Street will be developed. Getting to the historic centre, so the key feature particularly of lemon-scented gum, if you get into the next slide there, Catherine. So the historic town centre of Bayswater is defined for King William Street or lemon-scented gum. So this is the area, again, looking at the previous heritage work, we did have an independent heritage review of the option for a historic precinct, but also the contributory buildings. The key defining feature, while there was, as happened in a lot of historic areas, people living within the town centre, and that's an aspect we're trying to bring in, but some of the residential buildings, what was really reflective in terms of the contributory streetscape was the commercial type of buildings, highlighted there in blue. So we're really looking for those contributory places to be retained, adapted, reused, and celebrating into King William Street. So they're defined there. The numbers tie back to the heritage list or our heritage inventory under our planning framework. So they clearly identify where those contributory places are within the main street, and we're looking for those to be preserved with the newer development to be developed around those to continue to tell that story that we've touched on, but really highlighting where those buildings are. So any development coming forward has a clear understanding of where those places will be. Moving out of the south side and across to the north side, we head into the Red River Gum sub-precinct. So this is getting to, again, potentially what is still part of the commercial element. So while we define the main street and that heart being the King William Street area, we do expect the town centre, the mix of retail, commercial with residential to be on the north side as well. So this is coming down Beachborough Road South. What we heard in relation to this one, the key outcomes from the community survey, specifically or largely being around the improved connection between north and south again. Again, if there's going to be commercial or retail, making sure we can connect through from this area down into lemon-scented gum or King William and vice versa. A place known as being a sustainable community, mix of housing types. So we know people have been through what you've told us, so people have lived in Bayswater for 40 years, want to stay in Bayswater for another 40 years to make sure there's housing opportunities available. And enhanced tree canopy, which I touched on earlier. This is an area and through the streetscape as well as the private lots that we're looking for that to be enhanced. Our key planning responses in that respect are to support the commercial, community-based and transient residential land uses. So perhaps some short-term uses in terms of, as well as traditional apartment style, a more boulevard style along Beachborough Road South, active streetscape characterised by that larger street setback to create a more comfortable and pedestrian environment, and a little bit distinct to that historic heart of King William Street, which has that nil setback, the existing built forms that really creates the intimacy in King William Street. So a distinctive place within Bayswater itself, so people can move around and interact in Bayswater in different ways, other than the diverse commercial land uses. In terms of the particular built form outcomes for Red River Gum, as say a setback from the street. Lemon Centre, Gummoor, King William Street, we're having that nil setback, that intimacy. So we're looking for a 2 metre setback in Red River Gum. So that might allow for a little bit more of a residential at ground floor, but really still looking for a commercial activated ground floor street. But the 2 metre setback allows to create more of a boulevard style as you come, as you exit Bayswater or come in to Bayswater down Beechborough Road South. The landscaping elements will provide greater shade and shelter, and the footpath awnings from those buildings again provide weather protection and pedestrian amenity. So really looking for a high quality public realm within Bayswater, reflective of the quality of the place. And also the retention of the existing mature trees and provision for new trees to continue to enhance that tree canopy, urban tree canopy in this area. As we've come into Bayswater and down Beechborough Road South, we get close to the train station and the train line. So that gets into, other than the intensity, we're looking for built form outcomes. So getting into the Magnolia precinct along Railway Avenue. So when we look for the opportunities for perhaps a larger scale development, looking for how will it interface to its neighbours? Where may the impacts be as the buildings start to get bigger? Naturally, there are impacts of overlooking to other sites. So more opportunity for greater setbacks, views, or particularly shadows cast by other buildings. So with the rail line running through Bayswater with the train station, that's of a particular height, and there's particular interfaces with that. Shadows cast from the south from in this Magnolia precinct. So the shadows cast from these lots will be more over the train line and the train line. The train station will be more the Olive precinct. We'll get to in a second. So that means these, we feel, have the opportunity to take on more built form without the impact as if you had people's backyards or existing houses on the south side, which would really create that amenity impact. So for this, we got to the 12-storey height limit. The things we heard from the community survey was the mix of housing, a place known as a sustainable community, and the enhanced tree canopy. So particular planning responses for the Magnolia sub-precinct was predominantly residential land use. So very wary not to stretch out, or people, we wanted that north-south connection not to stretch out the retail or commercial and dilute that vibrancy of Bayswater. So primarily residential land use within Magnolia. It is adjacent to the rail infrastructure together with Olive precinct, so it provides that transition to higher intensity in the frame precinct and landscape treatments, particularly with those increased setbacks to enhance the local streetscape character. In terms of built form there, looking for a 3 metre setback, slightly larger than the Beechborough Road South one, reflective of its residential land use. So that's from the street and supporting additional landscape and amenity for residents within that setback. It's safe and convenient pedestrian pathways to the main street and into the station, and step development to manage the interface between developments within the Magnolia precincts, but also those sites just to the north of it within the frame area, so that there is a reasonable depth in these lots. So these buildings will be able to be set back more so than on the south side to create a better interface with those other residential properties on the north of Magnolia. At the train station, so the north side, so the Olive precinct is one where we are looking for the more intensity of development. Height-wise, we talked about the 15 stories. There are a couple of elements in it, what we heard from the community survey and what we think can be delivered mostly in the King William Street. The community talked about the vibrant cafe, restaurant, bar culture with increased nightlife activity, a bit of a continuation from what was happening on the south side, with a mix of housing types through the apartment style, a place known for its sustainable community, the maintained character and style of the town centre, maybe not necessarily in its built form in this way, but the uses, and the enhanced tree canopy, all possible in the larger lots. The key proposed planning responses in the Olive precinct being the landmark architecture of a scale that's reflective of the location significant opposite the train station and plaza, that new development will be concentrated within this precinct to support the population growth that we're looking for in Bayswater. Diverse businesses and housing, including smaller intergenerational and affordable homes, the key theme coming out, and development to deliver a minimum of 5-star Green Star outcomes, which will be supported in our planning framework by our green building policy. It's not necessarily, it's referenced in the guidelines, but does sit within our policy suite separate to the guidelines. In terms of built form outcomes, we have for Bayswater, we have some specific sites. The Bayswater Hotel site, the community site, which are larger, can have some bespoke provisions in terms of those setbacks on the previous slide. For this one, it's 3 metre setback from the street for additional landscaping and amenity for the residents. It has that interface to the northern plaza of the train station, has safe and convenient pedestrian pathways to the main street and the station, and step development to manage interface with adjoining properties. And I might actually, if I can go back a slide, Catherine, if that's all right, just one thing I'll touch on also. We are aware there is some called diversity of the product type in this olive precinct. That does also include the Rose Avenue properties. So in that bottom right-hand side of the slide there are specific setbacks from within the community site, and also on the north side, the Bayswater Hotel site. So looking for a larger setback from those developments to those Rose Avenue properties to give some, ensure the amenity in that interface with those properties is managed reasonably and the best possible with the changing face of Bayswater. So that while it's within that larger olive precinct with all the things with increasing density, Rose Avenue I'm talking about, still trying to be considerate of how those things will interface as sites get developed going forward. And then we'll go forward into the red flowering gum precinct. So the last of the 6 sub precincts within the design guidelines. So we're almost there. And this is getting to where it's really starting to interface. We're not quite in the town centre into the main street, more residential in style, and those starting, the streetscape is more residential rather than commercial or mixed use, and really having that interface with the frame area or the existing residents in it. So what we can, the key outcomes from the community survey, the key themes being that mix of housing types, a place known for sustainable communities, and the enhanced tree canopy. Our planning responses in red flowering gum reflected this, or look to reflect this, by the predominantly residential land use, which I've mentioned, the high quality building design with development conscious of the adjoining residential areas, and the adjacent rail structure, particularly on the south side. So this precinct is split in 2 ways, some on the south, some on the north, particularly that area on the south interfacing with the rail infrastructure there across Watley Crescent. In terms of the specific built form provisions for red flowering gum, again, reflective of that residential use. So while a 6-storey maximum, similar to lemon-scented gum or King William Street, we are looking for that 3-metre setback from the street to support the residential interface with the street that exists more so along Hamilton Street, for an example, in those areas, as opposed to what we want in that main street setting. That'll also support the additional landscape and amenity, the enhanced pedestrian connections, and provide safe and convenient access, and the retention of existing mature trees and planting of new trees to enhance the urban tree canopy in these areas that are out of that main vibrancy, but really starting to interface with the broader residential area. So there's a step through our 6 sub-precincts in Bayswater as we've defined them through them. So hopefully that's given you an understanding of within your particular part of Bayswater, and also what is in that broader use, because it's not a big area, and we know you walk around, you live, you work. These days you probably live and work in the same place. So hopefully that gives you an understanding. Looking forward to getting some questions in this session and beyond to really work through and get the best outcome for Bayswater. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And that brings us to the end of our formal presentation this evening. Thank you very much for staying with us. We know it was quite detailed, but we felt that it was important to provide you with as much information as we could through the presentation itself. We are now going to begin with a panel questions. We have received a large number of questions this evening. We will do our best to get to as many as possible. If we don't get to your questions tonight, and we haven't been able to answer them through this webinar, please get in touch with us via our project website and email address. You will be able to get in contact with us by telephone or by email, bayswaterproject@developmentwa.com.au. I will provide these details post the panel, but I just wanted to let you know that we will do our best to get through as many questions that you've provided this evening as we can. And with that, I'd like to invite Matt and Ryan back to a panel discussion. And the first question tonight will go to Matt, and it is from Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. How much influence does the community have in this consultation process?
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Catherine. Can I just deviate for 1 second and just make a comment about the image on the screen? So we had a preliminary engagement with the METRONET community reference group last week, and they've raised a good point for me. So I just wanted to touch on it while I had a chance. Sorry, Catherine. This image it's not supposed to depict a specific point in the street, and please don't interpret it that those buildings you can see in that image are what's necessarily actually going to happen to those buildings. This is purely to give you a sense of what we're trying to achieve in terms of retaining that character at street level, generating that activity. And then as you look to the north up beyond the train line there, you can see where the higher density would go. Purely intended as a diagram to show what the future of Bayswater in the long term could look like. Please don't be too worried if you see a building there and you think the facade doesn't look like it should look like, or even more importantly, if it's your building. Purely a depiction of what the future of the area could look like. Sorry, Catherine, I'll answer the question now. Thanks, Ruth. how much influence does the community have in this consultation process? Yeah, really good point. So as I mentioned at the start, we are legitimately open to making changes to this document and accepting feedback, and our decision makers have been really clear about that as well, which is why I'm so keen for people to engage in this process and provide lots of comments on your views. So I think what we need to be mindful of is we're trying to achieve a balanced outcome here, and we are going to have to accept that there will be a level of density in the precinct, and we also can't compromise on retaining the character of the place and activating it and capturing what's already there. So the reality is we're going to have to reach a balanced outcome where not everyone is going to be completely satisfied, but the answer is absolutely yes. We're going to take comments on board. We will make proposed amendments to the document in response to the feedback that we receive. In terms of governance and how those comments are considered, when this goes through to our Land Redevelopment Committee, we provide a summary of all comments received to them, redacting any relevant personal information, of course, and explain to them the amendments that we've made to the document in response to those comments. Anyone who makes a comment as well has the opportunity to request to make a deputation to the LRC, which means come and speak to the LRC and further directly speak to that committee about your views. So long-winded answer, sorry, Ruth, but yes, we will absolutely take into account comments. And if there is an overwhelming demand, recognising that we do need to achieve some density and retain the character of the area, if there is an overwhelming consensus that comes in from the community, we will absolutely respond to what we receive and amend the guidelines, as well as present that to our decision makers. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Matt. The second question comes from a number of people. It is to Ryan. How will the traditional heart of Bayswater along King William Street be preserved?
Thanks, Catherine. And this is something I touched on briefly, but I'll try and expand on a little bit further in terms of, we've got a bit of an image that Matt's just talked about in front of us now, but again, the traditional heart, one of the things we heard through the survey, we understand one part that makes up that understanding of the traditional heart is its physical form. Trying to keep in a changing environment, that might change, but the traditional heart being really about how people use the space. So we're looking to, in terms of the land uses we're putting in the design guidelines, the mixture for nightlife, entertainment, dining, day and night, that people come in, so right from many years ago into more recent years, that people come in, they live up on the high ground, come into King William Street, and that's formed the traditional heart. It's that social interaction into it. So we're looking for people to come in, continue to be able to come into that space as they have done traditionally, and use buy their food, sit, meet their friends, meet their family, meet their visitors, also providing the opportunity for more people to live into that space. So enhancing the quality and that traditional vibrancy of King William Street. So while we appreciate that the built form will change and will evolve over time, that it is about the social interaction, but also what we're doing, as we touched on, is we want those contributory buildings, those contributory places to retain a strong presence in the King William streetscape. So that will provide the nil setback. Any new built form will have a reference to those buildings, but be of more a distinction in their design and materiality to really highlight and promote the buildings that already exist, the traditional buildings that people understand in that area, but providing that balance for more people, more vibrancy, more opportunity for that night and life entertainment, that social interaction, being what is the beating heart of Bayswater.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next question has also been asked by a number of people, and I'll pass this one over to you again, Ryan. Why has a maximum height of 6 stories been identified for all development south of the station?
When we looked at the heights that might apply through Bayswater, as we touched on, one of the starting points was the growing population, the changing nature of Bayswater with the increased size of people moving through in terms of the investment of the state government into the train station, and how can we best balance that? We've identified that while 6 stories in King William Street and south of the train station, south of the rail line, it's at the lower end. And what we're trying to do, one, there's a feasibility. So I've factored in the things of the topography of the land. So steeper sites, it's about 1 story difference from King William Street up to the rear lane on the east side, 2 stories on the west side, and then the interface. So we're looking for how that built form will interact with the sites around it. And particularly, we understand, well, we're aware of the heritage conservation area outside of the design guideline area, but how that interface will work. So it was really trying to get that balance of getting the vibrancy. We did get advice and input in terms of what will be distinct, what is feasible for construction in the area. So trying to get that balance of 6 stories gave us enough that advice that, and again, site by site will be each owner or potentially a developer might look at it with it through a different lens, but 6 stories provides enough to get development to come forward, mostly through amalgamated lots, as I talked to, but 6 stories also provides that distinction. This is the main street, this is the core. So the frame area under the structure plan already got to 3 and 4 stories. So 6 stories gave that distinction that when you're in King William Street at 6 stories, it's enough to give you that sense you are in the traditional heart, you are in the core, you are in the main street. With enough vibrancy, it still preserves the sunlight and access into the street, into that public realm, but really provided that balance of at the lower end of the spectrum for us, higher than the frame area, certainly, but lower than what is happening on the north side.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next question has also been asked by multiple participants, and it's to you, Matt. What if I don't want to develop my property?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, really good question, and something I meant to comment on in my remarks earlier. So thank you to those of you who have raised this one. The short and direct answer to the question is if you do not want to develop your property, you absolutely don't have to. So our role here is as planning authority. So we're trying to create a framework for landowners and people who want to develop their properties that they can do so. So we've created a framework that enables redevelopment to achieve the vision that we're pursuing. However, it's just a framework to create the opportunity. Individual landowners completely reserve the right to continue living in their existing property as they are unchanged. Just a little expansion on that. The other thing I meant to mention earlier is Development WA wears multiple hats, and people might know of those various multiple hats. So we have a regulatory function, which is the one we're talking about today. We create frameworks, which essentially means we assess proposals as they come in from the private sector. Development WA also has a development arm where we act as the land developer, doing subdivisions and works and taking sites to market and that sort of thing. In this instance, we're wearing the first hat. So we're wearing the regulatory hat. The buildings on the screen, if they were more than an artist's impression, Development WA wouldn't be building those products that you see above King William Street or the depiction of King William Street. We're just creating the planning framework to create the environment for those willing to do so, that they can undertake redevelopment. Long-winded answer, sorry, but the answer is absolutely, you do not have to. You may continue living in your existing property.
Thank you, Matt. Our next question has been asked by a number of people as well, and it's to you, Ryan. The question is, what about sustainable design? How has this been considered?
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for asking the question, and a good one. I think I made a reference to it a few times in terms of our planning responses of sustainable outcomes in our area, and good to be able to the opportunity to expand it. Part of our policy suite for Bayswater, it's something that we've applied throughout our redevelopment areas and successfully so, is we've got the design guidelines that talks about high quality, sustainable outcomes, and that's partly assessed in what comes into under the 10 principles of high quality design, which we use consistently with our Office of the Government Architect and our design review panel. And one of those is sustainable outcomes or sustainable building, and that can get into some of the passive features of cross ventilation, airflow, access to natural light, those type of things. So that's partly in the design. The other thing that we use in our redevelopment areas in our planning framework, which is a little bit unique in the context of Perth, but we have applied across our redevelopment areas. We do have a green building policy, which I mentioned. And in effect, what that means is every development in Bayswater, save for single houses, we are looking to achieve a Green Star rating. The Green Star rating started at a minimum of 4-star Green Stars. So every approval we give, we'll be looking for them to demonstrate through their development that they can satisfy that Green Star rating certified by the Green Building Council of Australia. So that gives a best practice outcome. So we're looking for Bayswater to every development to be that. They can achieve that in a number of ways. So because the Green Star Council of Australia, it's nationally recognised and green building councils exist all over the world, they get points through different ways. So we're not specifying specific targets in Bayswater for particular water use or particular recycled materials or anything like that, because they're constantly updated as people get better at those targets and that bar continues to be raised. So we leverage through our Green Building Council to those things. 4-star throughout Bayswater, except for the Olive Precinct. Given the prominence and the landmark developments we're expecting there, we've set a 5-star minimum for that. So a higher Australian best practice is the language used by the Green Building Council. So we think through those mechanisms through our planning process. We'll be looking for proponents to demonstrate that, their pathway to a Green Star rating at DA stage and certification as they build the building. We think it's a good approach for us in terms of our unique feature of redevelopment area, and an example being just recently the Australian Fine China project in Subiaco. On the news last night, the Sentinel developer, under that framework, under that policy, has produced Australia's first net zero carbon building. So as an example of assisting or guiding and helping the developers consider those things early, not only have they satisfied our planning framework, they've then gone on and developed an Australian first. So hopefully that sets a good framework for Bayswater as well.
Thank you, Ryan. The next question is an excellent segue into your answer there, and it comes from Jessica. How will Development WA ensure good quality building outcomes are achieved?
Oh, do you want me to start with that one, Ryan?
Yeah, go on.
I'll start with it and then Ryan can jump in and embellish on my answer. I think he's just gone some way towards answering that one there with the Green Star rating, which is really important. The couple of key components to me, though, firstly, the design guidelines themselves, in a way, go a fair way towards ensuring high quality design outcomes. So again, using the example on the screen, and Ryan spoke about setbacks earlier, by requiring development that occurs above existing buildings and within that town centre area, by requiring it to be set back from the street, that's ensuring that you preserve the ground level activation and that the development above isn't overbearing and doesn't dominate the streetscape. So the design guidelines in themselves, which also talk about material and character of development, go a long way towards ensuring high quality design. But a really key component of our planning system is the use of design review panels. So when we receive a significant application, we have a number of design review panels that we use, which are external design experts, otherwise known as architects, and they go through a review process with proponents to refine their designs and ensure that they're getting the best possible outcomes. In Bayswater, I would have thought there'll be a particular focus around the historic character and activating those existing buildings and ensuring that development above is complementary. So that design review process informs our assessment, goes into the planning officer's consideration, and then forms part of the recommendation for approval or otherwise to our decision makers, the Land Redevelopment Committee that I referred to earlier. So that design review component, coupled with the design guidelines and the requirements under the design guidelines, hopefully get us a long way towards ensuring good design. Ryan, did you want to add anything to my answer on that one?
I think that's pretty comprehensive, but I think the other one, just the reference to what makes good design, those 10 design principles in terms of the design experts being architects, while largely there will be architects providing that advice, which will influence through to our decision. It's based on those 10 principles set up under Design WA that is used across the state and starting to develop some really good design outcomes across Perth and continuing to grow those. But we do have the flexibility in our design review panel that we talked about landscape quality as an example. In Bayswater, we want that developed. So we'll adjust, and we have the ability to make sure we've got members of that design review panel, such as not just the built form architecture, but landscape architects as an example, to make sure that that landscape quality is delivered through the sites and that advice is coming through us and really apparent in our assessments as well. Because we want all those aspects of high quality design, not just the best materials, the best shapes, the best forms of a building. We want high amenity, high landscaping, high quality across the board.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our next question comes from Stephen, and it goes to you, Ryan. Are properties identified in the frame precinct subject to Development WA planning or the City of Bayswater framework?
It's a good question, thanks, Stephen, and it's one that does come up, given Development WA in a redevelopment area is, while we do have 5 now across Perth, it's not something that is particularly common across the scale of Perth. So really, I guess the simplest answer is it exists under Development WA and our design guidelines. We've picked up the structure plan that was approved, Matt touched on, approved by the Planning Commission, was embedded in the City of Bayswater's local planning scheme not long before we introduced our planning authority, but in fact for the frame, we've picked up the provisions that were in that structure plan. That applies under our planning framework, but they are the same, if that makes sense. So for simplicity reasons, to make the process simpler, all development applications that are within the entire project, both the core and the frame, come to Development WA. appreciating tonight we've focused a lot on the detail of the core, but those frame provisions do exist and are replicated, for want of a better word, in Development WA's framework, and that's what we'll use to assess all those applications that exist in the frame area of the Bayswater project.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next question comes from Lisa, and Lisa asks about the R codes, and she asks, what R codes apply to the frame precinct?
Thanks, Lisa. And I think directly related to the one we were just talking about and the answer to Stephen's question of the provisions. So the structure plans set up R code zonings across the frame area with a, if you like, a open-ended or more bespoke R coding in the core area, what's called an RACO zone in the core. So that allowed us to develop the detailed design guidelines. But in the structure plan across the frame area, it does still talk to and reference and prescribe traditional R codes that generally range between R40 and R80. I won't go through each part of the frame particularly, but I'm happy to answer those questions specifically. If individual landowners have that particular question and they're unsure of what that structure plan, that approved structure plan from the Commission said, if their property's in the frame area, we're happy to, perhaps not tonight, but to answer the question. But broadly speaking, R40 around the edge into R80 on the edge of the frame to the core. And they are shown in, I think it is in our design guidelines, but also in the structure plan that will be on our website and the framework.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next question comes from Ruth and Georgia. What is in place to stop development exceeding the maximum building height than the maximum heights included in the draft design guidelines? Matt, I'll hand that one to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, thanks both. Very good question. So in answering it, an application can be received. A proponent can lodge an application for anything. So they can submit a building of any height. That certainly doesn't mean it's going to be approved. What stops it from being approved is the planning framework and the decision makers who are tasked with assessing it. So a building can be approved over height. That is technically possible. And this is a good opportunity to talk about the discretionary clause, as we call it in the design guidelines. You'll find it in chapter 1. Discretion is a really key component of the planning system, and you see it elsewhere beyond redevelopment areas. We've included a really robust discretionary clause in this particular set of design guidelines based on some of our recent experiences in other redevelopment areas. So essentially the premise for discretion, and discretion is regularly applied to height. That's often where the discussion comes from, hence why I've made this segue. The point with discretion is if a proponent can offer a solution that satisfies the vision and objectives of the precinct in a way that differs from the prescribed requirements, but it gets a better outcome, then discretion allows that to be achieved. And discretion might sound a little bit scary, but it can actually be a really good thing. If we're overly prescriptive and we require developments to comply to a completely prescribed framework, sometimes we miss out on getting better development outcomes that actually benefit the community more. So that framework that we've put in place for the discretionary clause in this instance, as I've said, a proponent can come up with an alternate solution to achieve the vision and objectives. In doing so, they need to achieve design excellence. So I mentioned earlier, they need to achieve good quality design as determined through our design review panel, which I mentioned earlier. We also require proponents to deliver additional community benefit if they're seeking discretion, particularly around heights. If they're going to seek discretion, they need to demonstrate additional community benefit above and beyond what we would expect from a normal proposal. And this is also based on recent experience. In determining additional community benefit, we have the ability under the design guidelines to require a proponent to prepare a community needs assessment report, we're calling it, whereby they're required before they come to us and lodge their application, or before their application is considered, they need to demonstrate that they've engaged with the community, being the people on the ground and the local government. They've engaged with them, explained their development proposal, and explained the benefit that it's going to deliver to the community, and evidence that the community supported it. Benefit can come in a couple of ways, in my view. So one can it can simply be the design. So we do look for beyond just the design, but often the design may in itself present a community benefit. So if to use the example of the towers at the end of the road on the screen we're looking at the moment, a taller, more slender tower might actually have less ground floor area, creating less people on that site, less traffic impacts, less overshadowing because of the nature of the building, less impact on view corridors. That design benefit might actually be in the interest of the community. The second aspect of community benefit, the more sort of tangible follow-on component, is what does this development deliver that the community gets out of it? So we've actually gone to the lengths of prescribing a few of the key community benefits that we think the community wants to see in Bayswater based on that earlier engagement work. And that's around, so we've talked about tree canopies and landscaping. So a big one is provision of deep soil landscaping, which means more dirt that can have bigger trees, which will increase tree canopy. That might be in the community's interest. Another really good example in Bayswater is activation of a historic building. So if we come forward down King William Street here, a developer may seek discretion on one of those towers above the main street, but in exchange for that, they might be doing a really good job restoring and activating a heritage building at ground level, which could present a benefit to the community. Others could be around the provision of housing diversity, affordable social housing, that sort of thing, which is a long-winded answer to your question, to the two of you who submitted that. But the opportunity is there for heights to go above. However, again, our decision makers have been really clear. You'll actually see when you get into the document in the olive precinct, we've said that discretion will be applied up to 18 stories. So it's a 15-story zone. We've said discretion's in the realm of going up to 18 stories, subject to those community benefits that I've just detailed. So we've left the door open for that opportunity that heights may go above. However, they really need to demonstrate a commensurate benefit to justify in terms of design and community benefit as to why that should be supported. I hope that may add some clarity, but I would point you towards the discretionary clause, which is 1.5 in the design guidelines. And that's something we've put a lot of work into. So I'd very much welcome comments on that one.
Thank you, Matt. Our next question has also come from multiple people. Will there be any face-to-face consultation? And if not, why not? Matt, I might have you start with that one, please.
Yeah, no worries, Catherine. Thanks, everyone. Yes, we're available for face-to-face consultation. Tonight, we've elected to go for this virtual town hall as opposed to an in-person one, where, as I said, we're just really keen to get as much engagement and as many comments as we can on this process. And we thought this mechanism was a really good opportunity to reach out. It's a lot easier for people to pick up their computer and dial into this as you get on with your evening, as opposed to having to make the effort to come to a town hall. The reality of those situations as well is that there's going to be polarizing views around this in the community. There's obviously pro-development, anti-development segments, and that's absolutely fine. But we wanted to give everyone an equal opportunity to speak up and engage on this process. The other sort of conventional method is pop-ups and turning up at shopping centres and things like that. As you've probably seen evidence tonight, this is a fairly detailed and lengthy conversation. We weren't sure how much value we'd get out of Ryan and I standing in the street and having people approach us for this process. Saying that though, the answer is yes, there's absolutely face-to-face consultation. We've already done quite a bit, and we are extremely available to meet with groups or individuals as required beyond this meeting. So I'm sure we're going to get to the contact information, but we are more than happy, as we already have done with some groups, we're more than happy to meet with people in person if there's further clarification required.
Thanks, Matt. I might just add to that if I can as well. We will be making this webinar available post this session as well. We felt one of the ways that we could get the information out to you was to provide quite a detailed information session through this format, and then provide that online to hopefully answer a number of questions from the community. We have provided hard copy versions of the design guidelines and the fact sheets that go with those at the Mainlands and Bayswater libraries, and there are copies available also at the City of Bayswater. And just to reiterate, if you do have any questions and you would like to talk this through in more detail, we are of course available, so please get in contact with us. Our next question goes to Ryan, and it comes from a number of people, and the question is, how will the transition in height between the core and precinct area be managed?
Thanks, Catherine, and to the people for asking the question. So touch on the best way we can see through our planning framework to preserve those buildings that have been identified of heritage significance is a starting point to identify where that is, what those buildings are, where the fabric is, the reason for the listing. And that's been done through the City of Bayswater's heritage list. It was undertaken of identifying those properties across the City of Bayswater, but also included the Bayswater project area in that. That heritage list, as it applies to the Bayswater area, has been picked up under our scheme and is adopted by as the heritage inventory within our redevelopment area. So that means certain buildings within the project area have those specific heritage classifications on them, and that they range have a certain number rating to them, starting from a number one. Number one is generally a state listed item that they haven't been identified in Bayswater. So in 4 Bayswater, it ranges from 2 down to 4, and that generally rates from 2s where largely there's particular built form or existing fabric that should be retained, down to 4 where perhaps it's more reflective of a compromised historic fabric or a social aspect that can be preserved or adopted in a different way. So for us, it's about identifying that up front. Our heritage list identifies that, or a heritage inventory, and that can be found on our website. And as I touched on, that transitioned to an independent review of that work, and also the idea of a potential precinct. But we've identified that as a historic place around King William Street. So we've identified those, and again, not just the listed buildings, but what are contributory to the place along King William Street. So our framework to identify that for people looking to develop properties within the project area is that from right up front, we've identified what those important places, where that fabric is, what needs to be considered, looking for setbacks from that street along King William Street to ensure that that fabric is preserved, and the higher the categories, such as the Bayswater Hotel, the specific provisions in that olive precinct show the Bayswater Hotel building being retained as part of any development. So what we've done is identify those as clearly as we possibly can, but again, open to feedback and people's opinion of that in our planning framework. And that means as people come to us looking for to discuss what might happen on their site, that's clearly part of the conversation from the very first point. So for us, that's about openness, transparency and clarity, and looking to get the best outcome for Bayswater, but looking to retain that heritage fabric where it's been identified.
Thank you, Ryan. Now we are coming close to the end of time, but I would like to maybe propose 2 more questions. The first will be to you, Ryan. How will the amenity be considered when delivering density in Bayswater? That question comes from Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth. And one thing we've been talking for a while, but I'm not sure if we've said this specifically, that one of our approaches to the Bayswater design guidelines is it is based on Design WA, State Planning Policy 7.3, which works across the state now, and is starting to get to base level provisions around design forms, setbacks, those type of things. We've used that as our base with some Bayswater specific exemptions, variations to it. So in terms of things like, that's defined things like the side setbacks from where a building is being redeveloped for more density or intensity. The setbacks to the side and the rear have to be a certain distance. And we're starting point, we're proposing we use the state planning policy references. So that comes to, you might get 1 or 2 stories on the or walls, 1 or 2 story wall on the boundary. The next 2 to 6 stories in those lower areas have setbacks between 3 and 6 stories, depending on what's in that wall. Whether it's a blank wall, perhaps you can get a little bit closer because you don't have that privacy or overlooking. And then above that, into the tower forms of olives, as an example, you then get larger setbacks. So as the type of the use and those type of things, we're using those benchmarks used across the state in terms of privacy, overshadowing, those type of things. So our starting point is defining those setbacks, that built form that we think a site can accommodate, and we've set back buildings on the side and the rear to really try to deliver that as a starting point. But otherwise, our assessment will follow the same pathway as is used under Design WA, which is really looking to preserve view corridors, overshadowing, privacy. And again, so building forms overshadowing is where that overshadowing largely over less sensitive areas such as the railway line. Privacy we're doing by setbacks, window placement, those type of things will be considered. Design WA, our design review panel will be considered through those multiple aspects.
Thank you, Ryan. And our last question tonight has come from multiple people, and I will hand this to you, Matt. The question is, why have you provided a discretionary height cap in the Olive sub-precinct, but no other sub-precincts?
Thanks, Catherine. I thought that one would come up. That's a good question, and we actually got that at our preliminary community engagement workshop last week as well. I'll probably do now what I did then, and that's own up that we largely considered it in relation to the Olive Precinct. The reason we focused our attention there with that particular provision of, so that what we're referring to is we have a height of 15 in that precinct, and the design guidelines refer to discretion being considered up to 18 stories. The reason we did that is because obviously that's going to have a really significant impact. Those are quite significant towers that will be developed, and we wanted to make sure and try and provide the community with as much comfort as we could about what the maximum development potential there would be. So obviously those sites are a lot higher in terms of what height is permitted as opposed to the other precincts. So our attention was on them when we came up with that discretionary cap for that area. So that's the honest answer, is because that's what we were thinking about when we came up with that clause. As I mentioned to the smaller group last week, it's a really good point. And if people want to make that comment, that's something that we can consider through review of the design guidelines. If there's another precinct where it might be, or all precincts where it might be appropriate that we apply that. I would just add though that if we do include a discretionary cap elsewhere, then we are opening the door to development at higher levels in those areas. So we just need to be cognizant of that. If we have one number, then we've got one target. If we introduce a second one, then that might open the door a little bit more. So there's probably pros and cons to that. I don't know who asked the question and if they're looking for additional height or less height, but there's probably two sides to that one, but really good point. And please make that comment in your submissions.
Thank you, Matt. So we have come to the end of our panel discussion this evening. So I'd like to thank our panel speakers, Matt and Ryan, for joining us tonight. And I'd like to thank you all as well for joining us. It has been a long evening, and we hope that we have gone some way to addressing your questions this evening. As mentioned before, if we haven't had a chance to answer your specific question, please do email us on our email at bayswaterproject@developmentwa.com.au. Alternatively, please phone through and we will get back to you, 9326 3666. We are happy to take any questions. We will be uploading this webinar in the coming days. And if you've registered tonight, you will receive an email to let you know when that is available on our website. We will, of course, review our frequently asked questions, even if there are some questions that have been asked repeatedly this evening that we need to address, we will update those as well. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Just a reminder that the public comment period for the design guidelines is open until Thursday, the 26th of August 2021, and copies of the draft design guidelines are available online, and hard copies are available at the Bayswater and Maylands libraries, as mentioned earlier, as well as the City of Bayswater offices. Again, we do very much welcome your feedback on these design guidelines, so please visit us online and submit your comments. If you'd prefer, you are very welcome to also submit your comments in writing to Development WA. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and we look forward to hearing from you over the coming weeks. In the meantime, we say good night and thanks again for joining us.